Welcome, dear listeners, to a podcast that's about to transform the way you lead, the way you grow and thrive in your life and career. Get ready to embark on a journey filled with inspiration and self-discovery. This is Afshin, the host of the Getting Real podcast. And this season, I'm delighted to be joined by none other than my co-host, Vicky Davitashvili. Vicky?
Are you ready to embrace the joy of leadership, the power of self-discovery, and the limitless potential of your career, and ultimately your entire life? Join us on this incredible journey of transformation.
Yep, stay tuned because the best is yet to come. Welcome back, listeners. Afshin here from the Getting Real podcast. And as usual, I am here with my partner in crime, and Vicky and I today are going to be talking about guilt, and this in terms of how it's held by women, particularly those who are striving to get back into the workplace or remain in the workplace. So Vicky, I hope that I've articulated that really well, and over to you.
Welcome to this very important conversation, and I think that this is one that resonates with so many of us. So today we want to dive into the topic of, societal conditioning around motherhood, and especially motherhood and, the women that want to have we talk about this notion of work-life balance. Right? So we want to, as our whole selves, have both an element of us that is our career, whatever that might look like, as well as life, right? And we don't want to live in a world where we have to sacrifice one for the other. But unfortunately, whether it is because of the way that society is set up at the moment, whether it is our own conditioning, from generation to generation, the little sentences that we hear throughout life that you must sacrifice for your children, whether it is just, the norms and the expectations. I think this is a really important conversation, and I'll tell you why this is so important. So my kids are 14 and 11. And I really feel like I've had to go through an entire journey of being a mother in the workforce. And here was my journey. I had my babies, and of course, lots and lots of sleepless nights. And I have to tell you my story about my mom in order for this story, my journey, to make sense to you. So my mom, we grew up in the former Soviet Union in Georgia. So if you can think about there's Soviet Union, which was like Russia and Moscow, right? And they tended to be a little bit more progressive in their social norms in terms of women worked, women were educated, women were in the workforce in Russia. But in Georgia was more like the Turkey, Greece, even more conservative of a society where, women just stayed at home, right? And my mom, she was very modern for her time, and she didn't just want to stay at home. So she was extremely educated, extremely well-read, went to school, got married, started her own little business teaching. And when she had my sister, my father said to her, whatever money you're making, here's the money. He put it on the TV set for her. And he said, I will pay you your salary, but you will not work because you're going to stay at home and raise the kids. And so my mom embraced it against her will, but she was like, okay, I'll stay at home and I'll raise the kids. Then she had me. Then I was 6, 7 years old, and she saw that I was no longer in the home, and she was getting really bored. Now, this is a woman whose brain is constantly going, highly educated, and she needed the stimulation. And she decided to go back to work, and she started teaching and whatever and pursuing her passions. Fast forward, I'm having a kid. And, my husband and I, we're a dual income household. I went for my undergrad and I went for my MBA, and my mom looked at me when I got pregnant and she said, "Don't you dare leave the workforce. Don't you dare stay at home, because this child that you adore at the moment is going to grow up, and then what are you going to do? Do you know how much harder it is to go back after you have not been back in the workforce?" She said, "Don't you dare. Get all the nannies, get all the help that you need. Don't leave the workforce." Okay, awesome. I don't leave the workforce. I have baby number 2. While she's telling me not to leave the workforce, she's simultaneously telling me not to lean into my career right now and to put everything in my career on hold, because God forbid if I miss one little thing with my kids because I'm not around and I'm working too much, then I'm not a good mom, and then I have done wrong by my children. So there were these two opposing schools of thought kind of like coming at me, right, as I was a young mom in the workforce. And so I pause here because I want to hear your story, Afshin, your journey, and then I'm going to delve into kind of the statistics around how many women are actually working, and then what are all of the things that we create in our minds and the stories that hold us back from living our ultimate lives. So I want to pause here and I want to hear your story, Afshin.
Yeah, that's an interesting question that you ask. I come from a culture that is not very progressive. As you know, I'm originally from Pakistan, so there's not a lot of women who have the freedom to pursue careers that they enjoy, unless they are pursuing it because there is a real desperate need for income. Otherwise, women don't pursue careers as much. Interestingly, my storyline is a little bit different and almost the opposite of what you shared. I come from a very progressive family, wherein all the women in my family, not just in my generation, but also in the generation before mine and the generation before that, all had the opportunity to be equally educated depending on their choice, and work depending on their choice. And be in the workforce. So in my, and again, this was the same in both sides of my family. So my father's side of the family and my mother's side of the family have many examples of people from my mother's generation and my father's generation, and people from my grandparents' generation also, that were women and men that were equally educated and were working in, as doctors, as university professors, alongside the men who were in corporate, or again being doctors or university professors, as they wished. I was listening to your story and I was thinking to myself, in fact, the way I relate to this topic is that I acknowledge the privilege that I have had to have been born and raised in an environment that was very different from the external environment that could have influenced my opportunities. I was one of the first women of my generation to go abroad and study. So that was the big step, I think, that my previous generation and the generation before that did not have. But ultimately, there's always been a lot of support and a huge appetite for us to be equally qualified and to choose whether we wanted to then pursue our careers or pursue our personal lives, or a mix of both. I think it helped in that it's not just about having role models. It just existed, and I didn't see them as role models. I just saw them as a fact. But what it helped, in hindsight, is that we were not trying to be pioneers. I was not trying to be a pioneer in my immediate context. I actually had a lot of healthy discussions with other women from my parents' generation, and even in my generation, around juggling both. Right? We had very based on their own experiences, so they were also not going through this for the first time. And I think there is always a tug of war between when do you focus on work, when do you focus on life, when do you give up work, when do you give up life, how do you get the right balance. These kinds of conversations were evolved. So at least in my immediate ecosystem, we had a point of reference against which we then made decisions and moved forward. My mother has worked all her life, and I was very conscious and very happy to of course do the same. I had no other plans. I really did expect and plan to work and also have a family. That said, I think for me what was interesting was what was beyond my immediate point of reference. I've always acknowledged that the reason I have had the opportunity to pursue life on my terms, despite the societal norms that I have witnessed in my culture, is because I stand on the shoulders of giants who came before me in my parents' generation and in my grandparents' generation, who believed much ahead of their time that men and women had the right, an equal right, to access education and to work as they chose. And I think the only difference between the two, from a gender perspective, was that it was more of an obligation for the men and less of an obligation for the women. So we were more in choice about that. But aside from that, I like I said, I am very grateful, and I absolutely recognize my privilege in that people came before me, generations came before me, that carved the path for me to be able to walk. And for me, what's most important is to continue down that path, because I know how many generations it takes to keep this, to keep pushing this rock up the hill. And I know how many Sisyphus moments I have as a woman in society, despite this wonderful privileged position in which I've had to, feel that rock coming back down and then keep trying to push it up. I'm gonna stop there because I feel like I've shared a lot, and I'm curious what came up for you, or what more I could share in that context.
No, I think that's great. And I think, what you're doing is you're highlighting the importance of what example do we set for our children. Mm-hmm. Right? And one of the things that I'm coming to realize is that our children are watching us. And they're watching us from a very young age. And they're observing us. And they look at, are we settling in life? Are we pursuing our dreams? Do we feel like we're limited or unlimited? And I think that, they say show, don't tell. What we do with our careers, the way that we choose to live our lives and the way that we choose to lean into our careers, those are the messages that our kids are picking up. You picked up the messages in your family, right? That women were absolutely self-empowered. Women absolutely, can and deserve to have, the career that they want and desire, right? That you are full of choices, right? And that is exactly the example that I want to set for my children. And I know I'm starting to set that example for them, because I see how much more self-empowered they are versus the way I used to be when I was their age. They're already talking to me about studying abroad and how they want to experience the world. And, they just have a very different lens. And I'm so grateful that, I'm able to give that to them. So I think what your story and my story in very opposite dimensions highlights is the importance of what example we're setting for our children and for the next generations to come, right? As they watch and observe us. I want to give you a couple of statistics because I think data is really interesting, just around motherhood. So, according to data in 2022 or 2023, there are 24.2 million mothers in the U.S. workforce, and I did only look up. I think it would have been interesting to look up global statistics as well around this, but at least in the United States, right? That represents 71% of the population. And then there are 93% of working dads in the workforce right now. Now, you might say that the gap between 71% and the 93% is not that big, right? It's only 20%. It's not that big. But I don't think that tells us the whole story, right? I think the story lies in how are the mothers that are working or looking for work showing up for themselves, showing up at work, showing up for their children, versus how are the dads showing up and experiencing the same experience, right? Because you could live in the same household and you could have the exact same children and the exact same set of chores and the exact same of challenges, and yet the father's experience is going to be so vastly different from the mother's experience. And so I think that's where the story gets really interesting, right? And I know that before we got into this conversation, Afshin, I was telling you about how, like, for some reason, I'm attracting all of these women into my life right now who are coming to me and they're like, oh my God, Vicky, I see you living the life that you want to live. And I am so, like, impressed by you. And I want to do that and blah, 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 right? And then the moment I will say to them, well, what's stopping you? Like, why aren't you pursuing the life of your dreams? The number one thing, oh, I don't have time. Oh, no? Oh, I have 2 kids. Listen, I'm not taking away from having 2 kids and the amount of time that it takes to raise your children and the energy that goes in it. But with one client, I literally sat with her and I walked through her schedule. Turns out she doesn't work on Fridays. Turns out she's got all of this time while the kids are in daycare, after work, right? And what was interesting is that it's not about time. The crux, I think, of the issue for when it comes to pursuing your goals, your dreams as a mother, right, is the guilt that you place on yourself for asking your husband to help with the children, not picking up your kids, 3 hours early, but maybe 2 hours early. The guilt that, I'm sure a lot of us hear the same conditioning that my mother placed on me, right? Oh, no. You cannot be an executive and a good mom, right? This is not a life of and, it's a life of or. And it's all this guilt, self-placed guilt, society-placed guilt, and the guilt that our moms place on us as daughters. And this is not a statement that's coming from a place of judgment. I don't judge, I don't fault my mom for a nanosecond, right? She was doing the best she could based on what she knew, based on how she grew up. So I adore my mom, right? I'm not saying this from a place of judgment. I'm saying this from a place of awareness and a place of awareness, right? Let's be aware of what we say, and let's be aware of how we might be making other women and mothers feel in this world. So I'll pause here. I want to hear what comes up for you, and let's keep this dialogue going.
Oh my gosh, I really love where you're going with this. It's so interesting. It's true that people in our immediate periphery have a massive formative impact on the way that we walk through the world. And I say this from sort of the opposite perspective because of the massive formative impact that I had from the role models and the way women lived in my immediate family. As I walked into the world, which had different expectations, I felt a very strong backbone walking into that saying, I'm not sure that I entirely believe that, I'm not sure I entirely believe the messages that I'm hearing from everywhere else. And those messages are constant. So my first response is yes, immediate role models, immediate family has a really, really formative impact on women and how they show up facing these external challenges, i.e. outside of family, thereafter. In Switzerland, and then let me share some data with you. Since you shared some US data, let me share some Swiss data, because I was also reflecting on the same. In the early stages of the career ladder, you'll find in organizations that the balance of men to women is 37%. 37% of women are filling those roles in the early stages of organizations, and the remaining men. And then they call it the leaky bucket. Yeah, it gets less and less. So from what I understand of the numbers, and this is based on the 2017 Schilling report, that changes from 37% to 21% at middle management level, 14% at senior management level, and only 9% of women at the board level. So totally a leaky bucket of women falling out of the workforce slowly and steadily as they are as they begin to progress in the career ladder. And one of the reasons that is cited, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, is the stuff that happens after your formative years. Once you've stepped out of your immediate influence that comes from your family. There are so many drivers. It includes political setups, it includes societal setups, it includes the setup of the education system, it includes many, many things. There's a very small example that I'll share with you that will help us grasp that in its smallness will help you grasp the magnitude of the problem and the impact that it's had. The way the school system is set up, children from the day they start school until the day they end school, stops at 12 o'clock and restarts again at 1:30. So children are required between 12 o'clock to 1:30 to have lunch somewhere. None of the schools here provide that. That does not happen. So every child who is part of the public schooling system goes home. And this is a societal issue that has been spoken about, that has been raised again and again and again and again and again and again in the system, is how forbidding it is for two parents to be at work when children have to stop school at 12 and go home to have lunch. It is exacerbated by the fact that there are limited spaces in the daycare system, the subsidized daycare system, for children to go and get lunch from the subsidized daycare system and then come back to school. Now, while the Swiss government wrestles with the fact that there need to be more people in the employment pool, more people out there working, they have not yet been able to solve for the problem that women cannot work because the traditional role for the woman is that she's the one who's supposed to stay at home and provide breakfast for provide lunch for the children when they're done with school at 12 until 1:30 in the afternoon. People like me who've had the experience of not having to deal with these limitations and have had the experience of raising healthy children in the absence of these designed limits to keep women in the workplace, out of the workplace, so that they're at home doing their duty, will challenge that. But if I grew up in an environment where this was okay, this was the expectation, that of course you as a woman should be the primary caretaker and you should be feeling guilty for doing anything except raising your children and wanting to have additional outlets for your creativity, for your growth, for your contribution to the world, you should feel guilty for that. I would not question this, but I question it. And I think that's the more of us need to, regardless of how we were conditioned as we were being raised, need to be comfortable to question and stand up for our right to pursue a healthy balance with everything we choose to do with our lives. And we should be allowed and enabled and have a space to do that just as well as any other man.
Yep.
So I'll stop here. I know that was a long story, but yeah, that's sort of what came up for me when you shared yours.
I think that's really interesting, and you're touching on something bigger and broader, right? Because not only is it the conditioning, but it's also just the infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And is the infrastructure in place to help women be in the workforce? Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because I had forgotten this, but my kids, when they went to preschool, you're right, preschool is only a couple of hours in the morning. Mm-hmm. And I was lucky that by then my mom had moved here and she could go pick them up. Mm-hmm. But this whole juggling of like nannying and preschooling and this and that, I mean, it's a complete nightmare. It's a complete nightmare. And I wish that we had more infrastructure to just help, And then you think about single moms who don't even have the dad. Like, if sometimes I was staying back and had to go to a meeting, I could call my husband and he would drive over and pick up. Like, we found a way to help one another, right? Through that difficult moment. No, you're absolutely right. So I guess I would ask you, as we kind of have shared about our personal journeys, the lack of infrastructure, right? What can we do, right? What is within our power? Because I always try to look at like what's within my power, and how do we help, create a society where women and working moms are thriving, not surviving, not feeling guilty, not being ashamed, not being, perceived as a bad mom if she is, pursuing her career, but where we can have it all, you know? I mean, I can tell you what I'm doing at the very micro level. I'd love to do this at the macro level, but number one is I set the tone on my team. And this is with everybody. I don't care if you're a working parent or not. But I set the tone on my team that, you know, I believe in balancing work and life. I don't believe in there being work-life balance. It's not like, oh, I spend 8 hours at work and 8 hours on my home life. I think that's really hard. But I think you can balance work and life, and you can choose when you lean into one versus the other. I see that this brought up something for you, so I want you to jump in, give your perspective, and then I can keep going.
Yeah. Yes, there are definitely areas in which we have choice. And I think it's so important for us to do an inventory, right? I could go on and on and on about all the things that get in the way. For example, your employer's leave policy might not be favorable to working moms. Your government's policy on maternity leaves may not be favorable. Switzerland, in comparison to the rest of to other European countries, has a very limited maternity leave option. In Austria, you can leave paid and unpaid for up to 3 years once you've had a child and come back to your original job. But in Switzerland, it's a matter of months. So there's so many things, certainly, that can get in your way. And I think, one, it's really important to acknowledge that it's not a straight line. We are all, in our own geographies, in our own ways, going to find, and this will continue. I think they say it's going to take 157 years before we reach a level of equality. So we will continue to face these road bumps as parents and as mothers. And yet at the same time, I really want to invite women who want to be in the workforce and at the same time raise kids to really explore what options they do have available to them. Because there are some that we may not have yet explored. So some of the things I look at is I've changed how I speak to childcare responsibilities. I don't ask my husband for help. He's not helping me when we have a child that we are both responsible for. Instead, we look at it as who's going to do what, and then we do it. And so that's really important, the way we look at and the way we position ourselves in relation to childcare. And for me, it's both of us are equally responsible, and we lean into each other as and when, and we have very clear understandings of what he does and what I do. It's as clear as that. So the other thing is, don't feel bad asking for help. Actually asking for help. There's an interesting term in Switzerland that if you send your kids to childcare, you get known as, I don't know what it's called, Frauen something, but it's really, or Freundin something. It's a derogatory term. It means that you depend on others to look after your children, right? Don't let that kind of stuff take meaning in and allow it to have power over you. Don't. That's a perspective. Somebody else holds it. These are, held over hundreds and hundreds of years. They just come over. How would you like to define what good parenting looks like for you? Be comfortable to carve your own path, So a lot of it is about letting go of the guilt and embracing your opportunity to set a new status quo and seeing it as that. So I'm going to stop here. That was sort of what came up for me as I was listening to you.
I love that. I love that. To add to that, have the courage to be a leader and a mom. And what do I mean by that? When you need to lean into your kids, I think you can be honest about that at work. And you can say like, hey, my kid has this going on. I've got my work under control. It's going to get done. But during this 2-hour window, I need to be there for my son. I need to be there for my daughter. I think it's perfectly okay. And I think that that courage is only going to be respected, right? Instead of feeling guilty and bad about, oh, it's just kind of like the same way that you talk about the relationship and the communication style you establish with your husband. Have the same level of conviction at work, right? And it's not that work is more important or your child is more important. Both are important. And I think you make it crystal clear that both are important and that you can handle both, just at different times, right? Have the courage to stay in your own frame around that. So that's number one, because that is a big mistake that I have made earlier on in my career. I was always so afraid to talk about anything that I had to do for my kids, or, like I was really just like so worried about like being dinged for, being there for my kids, instead of just being like, hey, I have to be there for my kids, but I'm equally here for my work, So as a mom, just have that courage. The number 2 thing I would tell you is end the guilt. You are the best mother in the world for your kids. There's nobody else that they want or love more than they love you as a mom. Can we just establish that? Mothers have a very special place in their children's hearts. This is not to say that the dads are not as special. They are. They're equally as special. They're just special differently. My husband is the fun person. He's the one who played with the kids. And I was that like, right? I'm sick, mommy. I need to be with you, right? I have an 11-year-old. She still asks me to kiss her goodnight, right? Because we are their moms and we are special to them. And they're not going to love you any less. And you don't love them any less if you take an extra hour out for yourself, for either your sanity, mental sanity, or to just sit in quiet and think through, okay, if I want to launch this business, what are the 2 things that I can do to help me get there? Why should you feel guilty about that?
I love that you say that. And I really wanted to, what came up for me, and I'm sorry, I just jumped in, but I think it's a really important moment, and going back full circle, to bring in your children into this journey of what you're creating that is perhaps different and new, or at least evolved in the world. And I think that to see you healthy striving is something that is such an important role modeling for your children regardless, that bringing them into your journey and saying, because I speak to my son about this all the time. He lives in an ecosystem in which women, as I told you, do not have the ability to stay in the lane of career progression due to external factors and also due to societal pressures. Women didn't vote in Switzerland until the 70s. So in that sort of traditional setup, he sees me, right? And we talk about it all the time. I share with him how important it is for me to continue some traditions that were set up in my family, despite the culture that I grew up in order to honor the importance of women and men and their equality. How important it is for me to strive to continue to do this. And that, I do this for all of us, not just for me. I do this for him. I do this for future generations. I do this because it's important. And that healthy striving, that purpose-driven striving, is something that I hope he'll carry with him into the future as he becomes the next leader. And he can, I think we have a very unique advantage as mothers. You said it yourself. Our kids need us differently. And one of the most important roles that we play as mothers of children is being the most influential person in their lives in their formative years. And to bring this part of you into the conversation and allowing them to be a part of this, it is such an empowering aspect for them. They will strive healthily in the future as well, and it is also really empowering for the future generations as well. So you don't have to strive in this alone. It doesn't need to be your secret guilty striving. It can be a team effort. Bring everybody into this storyline. Even your employer, bring them into your storyline. Tell them what it is that makes you bring it all to work every day, and also what it is at home that inspires you. And I think it makes your whole story. And I think that's so compelling. I'm going to stop here.
No, I love that. I love that. You know, it's interesting because I've been really reflecting a lot lately on what is my why. And I've been asking people, what is your why? Mm-hmm. And when you know what your why is, you can figure out anyhow, right? Viktor Frankl said that. So know your why. Mm-hmm. And then you will find your how.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I guess I'll end on this note, you know, as a mom, you carry on your shoulders, right? Not just the daily chores and responsibilities, but you also carry the responsibility of setting the example. Mm-hmm. So live that life, mm-hmm. Live your life fully, completely. Mm-hmm. And don't let motherhood stop you, ever, mm-hmm. ever. Let that inspire you, drive you, amplify you. Mm-hmm. You know, and just go for it. It's totally available to you. Let go of the guilt. Nobody needs it. No one's benefiting from it. Let go of the shame. Nobody's benefiting from it. And just lean into, you know, the superhuman that you are, the superpowers that you carry. Mm-hmm. So I'll end on that note. Everything you want is completely available to you.
Stay tuned because the best is yet to come.